Good Yontif. It's truly magnificent to stand on this bima, this beautiful evening, and be able to look out on you, our Kihila Kadosha, our sacred community, on this new year. It's especially gratifying to be all together this evening in our sanctuary as we use our new machzor for the very first time. This is my 50th Rosh Hashanah. I don't remember the first few, of course, but I do recall many High Holy Day services from my childhood. And I remember the deep thoughts that I had as I sat in the sanctuary back in Omaha with the liturgy unfolding for these days of awe. I recall looking up into the heavens and thinking, I wonder how many separate panes of glass there are in that stained glass window up there. There must be 50, maybe 100. I know. I'll count them. 1, 2, 3. Sometimes my mind would drift to existential concerns, and I'd find myself thinking, okay, I'm stranded on a deserted island. I can only take 5 record albums with me. Which do I take? There was always time for a story problem or two. Let's see here. We're on page 17. The closing song is on page 54. I'd estimate we're going about 35 pages an hour. Assuming we do some skipping here and there, and please God, say we'll do some skipping here and there. I'm guessing unless the choir takes us on a major detour, I'm in the parking lot in an hour. Oh wait, the rabbi's sermon. Time to recalculate. Look, I understand that this is not a widespread phenomenon. This counting business was my thing. None of you would be so distracted as to engage in any of the aforementioned activities. Okay, so maybe I'm not the only one who has drifted a bit from time to time over the years during these worship services. Maybe we all have. But the truth is, we shouldn't drift or daydream, because these days really matter. They help us make meaning of our lives and the world around us. Instead of counting panes of glass or pages in the prayer book, we should be counting our many blessings with gratitude and our many failings with regret. We should be thinking deeply about how best to make the precious time we're allotted on this earth truly count. These Yamim Noraim can be the most stimulating, invigorating, awe-inspiring days of our lives, days which help point us towards meaning and purpose. And this is precisely what our Judaism more broadly is all about. And oy, do we need it, what our Judaism offers right now. We need clarity in a moment when the very concept of truth is being challenged. We need faith, something that we can hold on to, that can help us to navigate the fear and the uncertainty in a time of senseless violence in our cities, our malls, and even our synagogues. We need to know that our lives count unconditionally in this time of unprecedented change, amidst disruptions that make us wonder if the skills we have will be of any value in the future. We need a tradition that points us toward compassion and kindness and love in a time of so much senseless hatred, division, and rancor. We need to believe in the future in a time when climate change makes us question if our world will even be inhabitable for our grandchildren. So right now, perhaps more than ever before, we need what our Judaism can offer us, a 3,000-year-old tradition that inspires us to believe that there is meaning in the cosmos, that our deeds do amount to something, that we can make a difference, that our lives count. There's a mystery at the very core of our being that our Judaism helps us to understand. We gaze up into the heavens or into the great depths of the sea or into the eyes of a stranger, and we wonder, what is being asked of me? What should I do? How should I respond? Or as the question is asked by the prophet Micah, animating arguably our entire Jewish tradition, what does God demand of me? Our Judaism inspires us to believe that the very fate of our world depends on our responding to that question wisely, compassionately, and justly. So tonight I want to share a few stories with you, stories that carry teachings from our Jewish tradition across the ages that I think we need right now at this very moment. Telling these stories, reflecting on their meaning, allowing them to guide our lives, this is at the core of what it means to be a Jew. The first story is among the oldest of our tradition. It's about our patriarch and matriarch, Abraham and Sarah. The Midrash teaches us that Abraham and Sarah's tent was designed with openings on all sides so that passersby could be welcomed from whichever direction they might come from. And what makes their radical hospitality even more impressive is that their tent was pitched in the middle of a barren landscape, in the harshness of the desert, in a land that was not their birthplace. They, after all, were immigrants. But instead of closing themselves off, instead of worrying only about their own needs, as we might expect them to do, and the needs of their own household, they opened themselves to the outside world. They reached out to strangers in friendship, and in so doing, they built a great nation. They built Am Yisrael, the Jewish people. And don't we need to remember that story right now, at a time when hearts and doors are closing to the other all over the world? In a time of hatred and xenophobia, our Judaism teaches us to remain open to possibility, to kindness, to understanding, and to love. In a time when we might wish to close ourselves off or shut ourselves in, our tradition teaches us to open our doors, to open our hearts. Our Judaism calls us to listen with compassion to our neighbors' stories, to come to know one another more deeply so that we can bring friendship and harmony into our world. And since successful relationships are always mutual, we have good reason to trust that if we listen with compassion to our neighbors' stories, they'll listen with compassion to ours. And we Jews could use a little more compassion in a time of increasing hostility towards our community. The second story is Judaism's master narrative, the story of the Exodus. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. God freed us from bondage so that we could be a light unto the nations, bringing goodness, hope, and freedom to the world. We know this story so well that it's easy to forget the profundity and audacity of the message. Whatever narrow space we find ourselves in, whatever it is that enslaves us, we believe that God wants us to be free, and that God needs us to be God's partner in freeing others. And if you question the power of a story to change reality, think about the way this story inspired African American slaves to dream of a future in which freedom was possible. Once they heard the story of God's instruction to Moses to tell Pharaoh to let my people go, they knew that someday, somehow, they too would go forth to the promised land just like our ancestors did. Our master's story reminds us that even in the midst of the darkest night, we will never give in to despair. We will never give up hope in a brighter future for our children and grandchildren. No matter the challenge, in the narrow spaces of our lives, we will always continue to believe in redemption. In part, to illustrate just how dynamic our tradition is, the third story I want to share happened just a few weeks ago, right here at Stephen Wise Temple. I received an email from a stranger with a request for help. He and his husband, both Israelis, had just become fathers to a little girl. They needed a rabbi for the conversion. You see, the egg donor was Jewish and the father was Jewish, but the surrogate was not. And so halachically, they would need to go to the mikveh to ensure the Jewish status of their baby. I said I'd be happy to help. And then I asked if perhaps they wanted to come for a Friday night service here at the temple for a baby naming and a blessing. If you were here that night, well, there wasn't a dry eye in the Plotkin Chapel as we welcomed their baby into the community. It was a sacred moment, not just for her parents and not just for those of us who witnessed it, but more broadly for Am Yisrael, for the Jewish people, because a new soul had entered our small little tribe. Her fathers wept tears of joy, joy for the precious child that had entered their lives, joy for their love for one another and for her. But there was another joy as well, joy that this Jewish community had opened its arms in love. Look, I'm not going to pretend that Abraham and Sarah, 3,500 years ago, would have opened their tent so warmly to this family. But that's just one more reason why Judaism is so urgent today. It is a dynamic, resilient tradition that evolves over time. Our Judaism continues to be relevant to us because it is a tradition that has always been open to change. It has always been ready to meet the challenges of the day with creativity. So when we welcomed that baby girl and her family at Friday night services, we were in our own time and in our own way upholding and supporting an imperative of our tradition that goes back to the time of Abraham and Sarah. The promise of parents to welcome and raise their child as a Jew. In an ever-changing world, we are so fortunate to be the inheritors of a tradition that is at once so deeply rooted and at the same time so very agile. There's a fourth and final story that I want to suggest to you. It's the most personal story of them all. It's the story each one of us is writing. It's the story we tell in the way we live our lives, in the work of our hands, and in the work of our hearts. It's the story we tell in how we give, in how we live. These days of awe, filled with the imagery of the book of life, urge us to think deeply about these stories. What story are you writing? Now is the time to reflect on it and ask yourself if it is a reflection of the values you cherish. Is it a story you'd be proud to share with future generations? Are you perhaps a little anxious about the way your story is being told? About what it should say? About what it does say? About what the next chapter might be? When I sit down to write, sometimes I don't know where to begin. Sometimes I don't know what to say. So I search for inspiration. And as I think about this final story, the one I tell by the way I live my life, I'm inspired by the stories of our tradition, the ones that carry the values that imbue our lives with meaning. And the more of them I know, the deeper I wrestle with them, the richer and more meaningful my life is. And when I'm afraid, when I'm not sure what to do, I find strength and hope in that same tradition. So here's my invitation. Won't you come learn and celebrate these stories with us? We tell them every time we gather to study together. We tell them every time we gather to worship with one another. And we write them when we join hand in hand in acts of tikkun olam. We write them when we break bread together, when we make time for one another. The stories we tell, the stories we study, the stories we live, the story we write in our book of life. Here we are. The new year has arrived. May the stories we learn, the stories we tell, and the stories we live truly count.